All right. Last week we started an experiment, a thought experiment, and the idea was that we were going to vote ourselves to be a committee of people who were going to make all kinds of decisions for our economy. I described what a command economy or a top-down economy is, and that's where a government or a committee of people determine what things will be produced, how much different people are going to make, and so forth like that. The reason for all this was to discuss the morality involved in how our economic system works. And the reason why we're discussing that is because that is an extremely important thing for Christians to be considering, the morality of how our culture works. We don't have to necessarily like it to say that it's better than the alternatives, or we might decide that we really do like it, or we might decide that there are parts of it that we really don't like. But here, the important thing is to be able to evaluate those aspects that, from the point of view of the Word of God, that's a good result, and from the point of view of the Word of God, maybe that's not, okay? So we were going to work through that and try to decide, essentially, how wealth should be distributed. That's kind of another angle on this. And we talked about what wealth means, and this is really important that we think about. Because sometimes we think about wealth as just nothing more than how much is in your bank account or how much you make. But as we all know, nobody just gets money and just holds on to it. We get money in order to buy things with it. And the things that we buy with it, we might really say, excluding the things of the kingdom of God, okay, the things that we buy with money is the stuff of life. So that when we talk about the distribution of wealth, what we're really talking about is the distribution of the stuff of life. And some people have much more of the stuff of life than others for various and sundry reasons. And so we're asking the question, should that be? And should some people have more than others? And if so, why? Okay, and so that's part of the thought experiment. And so we're going to continue with this a little bit further. That's what I have up here. That's the experiment. We are a committee of very intelligent people who are very well intended. And we are going to try to answer these questions, how wealth should be distributed for the benefit of our neighbor. Now, last week, there were a number of objections that were raised, but people do this, and people do that, and people cheat the system, and so forth. But I'm wanting to ignore all of that for now. I'm not denying that by any means. But what we're going to say is we're not going to cheat the system. We're not going to be self-dealing. We're going to do what God wants as best as we're able, okay? That's what we're going to do. Now, the fact of the matter is, you might say that in the real world that's not how it works, and I will absolutely agree with that, and that might be one of the reasons why we don't do it this way in the real world, okay? But the fact of the matter is, that is something for us to consider. All right. So let's see. And I don't want to go through everything that we went through last week. We went through a number of important principles that we have to bear in mind about people. And the fact of the matter is, when we go about distributing wealth, we have to recognize that there are a lot of inequalities built into human beings. Okay? There's one sense in which we can say we are all equal. In the eyes of God, we are all of equal worth. Jesus died as much for one as for the other. Now that is a very vital and important theological consideration. However, for the purposes of our working here on our committee and trying to decide who gets how much, we could just say, since everybody is the same value, we're just going to give everybody the same amount. Okay, if we do that, then that's one way of answering the question. We might decide that that's not necessarily the best way to go about things. At any rate, that's an important thing. If you want everybody to have the same amount, then everybody gets the same amount. Well, that's easy conceptually. It may not be easy to do. But here's the thing. The fact that we are all equal in the eyes of God is where equality stops. We're all different. We are different in lots of different ways. We are different in very good ways. So some people are really good at some things and much better at some things than others. And some people are much more honest and decent than others, and some people are much harder workers than others, and some people are much healthier than others, and there's an almost infinite array of ways in which different people who are all equal in the eyes of God are different and unequal as concerns how things work here in this world. And that will be very important for us as we decide who gets how much and why, okay? So we talked about different ways that people are unequal. Some of us are better at being rational than others, but all human beings, no human being is always rational all the time. The only person who was only rational all the time, and even that, not quite, that was Mr. Spock. Remember Mr. Spock? Mr. Spock was only rational all the time, but even he, because there was little bits, every now and then you'd see, just because he was half human, if I recall. And so every now and then some little bit of something that would baffle him would come out, just some slight bit of emotion. But for the rest of us, human beings are motivated by lots of different things. Sheer rationality is one of them, okay, but not necessarily the chief one, depending. Okay, we're unequally motivated by doing what's right. Some people are more inclined to do what's right just because it's right, and some people are not all that interested. If there's nothing in it for me, forget it. Human beings are unequally motivated for doing what's for the common good, okay? I mean, so in other words, I can take for myself, but then I can ask myself this question: what if everybody did that? Well, if everybody did that, everything would be terrible. Well, it would be better for everybody if I don't do X, or if I do Y. Well, some people are really motivated by that. They want to do what's best for everybody. Other people, no. Again, if it's not for them, they're not interested. We have to take that into account too. Human beings are unequally motivated by selfish desires, which is just another way of looking at what I've been looking at. We all should act in our own self-interests, but selfishness means we act in our self-interest to the exclusion of other, perhaps more important interests, like the needs of our neighbor or God or the community. So those are all important considerations. We very quickly talked about how much should a person make? Should we have a minimum amount? And just talking about that, there's some important and difficult questions if we're going to, and then we have to ask questions about windfall, and what if somebody wins the lottery? Should they get to keep all that money, or is that fair? A lot of issues of fairness. Now, what I want to do now is let's look at, okay, well, we also talked about the difference between what a person makes and what a person has. So some people just have tons and tons of money. They don't really make much. It doesn't matter. They got so much they don't have to make anything else for the rest of their life. Other people make lots of money but spend lots of money. That's different things. All right, now here's where we are today. We are going to ask ourselves some questions about, remember, we are taking upon ourselves to make these decisions. Forget whether you want this job or not. God has just given us the job, and we're going to do the best we can at it. And the point of this exercise is to ask ourselves, how easy would this job be? And would you want this job? And could we even find the right answers if we wanted to? So, what factors should we consider in trying to decide how much a person should make? Or the related question, how much a person should have. But particularly, if we're going to distribute wealth. So I've got some things up here that we might want to consider. Here we have a job, and we're going to decide how much this job should pay. Now, of course, if we've decided that everybody being of equal value in the eyes of God should be paid exactly the same, this is easy. There's just a simple amount, and that's what you get. And you get that whether you have got this job or that job, or for that matter, whether you have any job at all. So, but we've decided not to do that because that would make for too short of a discussion. So here's one factor to consider. If we're going to pay somebody, here you are, you're going to get this job, should we consider how much a person needs in determining how much we're going to pay them? Some people need more. So this person has 6 kids, and this person is single. Should we pay the person with 6 kids more than the person who's single to do exactly the same job. I'm not giving you the answers, okay? I mean, the thing is, I don't know that you could make an argument, you could probably make 100 arguments against this, but the fact of the matter is, it's just something to throw in the hopper. It's something to think about. Is that an issue? Do employers ever give raises because they have a valuable employee who just needs more money because they have legitimate obligations? Which is different than they like to go to Tunica, and because of that they never have any money, so we better pay them more. Or they drink a lot, something like that. Okay, should we pay more for a job that takes more time? So if you work 8 hours a day, should you get paid more than if you work 6 hours a day or 3 hours a day?
Depends on what you accomplish in those extra hours.
Well, that's interesting, because if we just pay you for the amount of time, you know, some people can do in 3 hours what another person would do in 8. But what if you can't do it in 3 hours? You're just not skilled enough to do that. It's just going to take you 8 hours. 8 hours is 8 hours, no matter who. This is a funny little thing that sometimes happens, you know, when I'm billing for time. Because lawyers have to do lots of different things, and some of the things that take the most time are the most tedious and really almost brainless work. It just has to be done, and you have to look, you have to make sure that everything is, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. But it's not really complicated work, but it might take a lot of time. Then there are other times when you'll be sitting there and have a flash of brilliance, and it took you 5 minutes to draft up a real quick motion that you filed. But you know that that motion might be the case. One takes 5 minutes, but is very valuable. The other takes all day, but, I mean, a monkey could do it. Well, maybe not a monkey, but, so that's another consideration. Some jobs, just by their nature, take a lot more time, and it doesn't matter how brilliant you are, it just takes time, but it's not that valuable. But 8 hours of one person's day is 8 hours of another person's day. Right? Or is that true? We might say that some people, for 8 hours is much more valuable for them than for another. How about the amount of effort that goes into a job? Here's somebody that has to go through paper and make sure that there are no misspellings. Here's somebody with a shovel and has to dig a ditch. They have to dig a big ditch. They have to dig a lot. This person works for 8 hours looking at papers and shuffling papers, not thinking much, just shuffling papers. This person works for 8 hours with a shovel digging, not thinking much, but digging. Yes?
Well, in the Old Testament, again, God gave a lot of rules for how the Hebrews should live. And even before they had a king, they had judges.
Yeah.
The judges, what's the overlap? The judges do a lot of what council would do, what we're talking about?
I don't know of anything in the Old Testament that would have judges or leaders setting prices. I frankly don't really know how most prices were set in the Old Testament, so I really don't know. But we're raising the other question. 2 people work for 8 hours, 2 people do something that needed to be done, 2 people do something that doesn't take much brain work, one takes a lot more physical effort. Do we pay more for physical effort? Or here's somebody who doesn't have to dig, but they have to spot misspellings in pages and pages and pages of text, and it's mentally very draining, but physically very easy. Some people can do the one and not the other. Can't do the other and can do the one. What do you think, Steve? You want to dig ditches, or you want to look for?
Well, kind of on the same point I was saying before. So, I mean, you know, in the Old Testament, we have rules about not boiling a calf in its mother's milk, and how the length of the altar, things like this, and what foods you can eat. You have a lot of stipulations about that.
Yep.
And not on price. I think that's kind of the center point of discussion. Why one would receive so much attention, the other so little?
Well, okay. I mean, maybe one thing that we could say, I guess just kind of thinking aloud by what you're saying, the fact that there isn't any price discussed, there's like prohibitions against usury in the Old Testament, and they're charging interest or too much interest. But that there, see, now Luther would say that there is such a thing as the right price. He would be more into this idea that there's a fair and just and right price, or fair and just and right amount that different groups and different people should be paid. And he probably would not be happy with the fact that the market just sets these. I don't want to get into too much specifics as much as I just want to note that while we're looking at a job, we're having to decide how are we going to compare somebody who is proofreading to somebody who's digging a ditch. How are we going to, and the guy who's digging the ditch has a family, and the person who is proofreading doesn't, or vice versa. Does any of this matter? As us as a committee, and we're trying to decide who to pay, how much gets paid for each job, does any of this matter at all? Yes.
Well,
I don't know about the calf in his mother's milk.
You know, Martin Luther once said that he'd rather be ruled by a competent Turk than an incompetent Christian.
Yeah.
That would imply to me, in very large part, is the practical limitations, but also the practical focus of the government. In other words, not that it's most important the government dictate morality, even though that can be very important, but instead, in other words, if the price is right, if it's working, that's practical. If you have strict moral rules about what is the right price, that might not be.
So Luther might say that competent rule by an unbeliever is itself a moral good. Would we agree with that? The competent rule is a moral good? Yeah, I think. So in other words, you can try to be moral and be incompetent, or you can not bother to be moral but be incredibly competent. And we might say that it is more moral to have the immoral person be competent. Do we agree with that? That it could be? We've talked about the effort that a person might have to put into a job, like digging a ditch is a lot more effort, or the mental effort of trying to proofread complicated text, as opposed to, I want you to put all the letters that end in, all the documents that start with the letter A in this pile, and B in that pile, and C in that pile, where there's not a whole lot of, but you still got to be there, and it's got to be done, and it's got to be done right. Then there's also the level of difficulty. Some jobs are just more difficult. They may not be physically difficult, or they might be. A mechanic involves more difficulty than digging a ditch. The work may or may not be as hard. It depends. But most of the time, I think digging ditches is probably harder than being a mechanic physically. But being a mechanic is more difficult. I think we would all agree with that. And we might also agree that that being a jet engine mechanic is even more complicated and necessary that it be done exactly right. So we've got lots of things that we want to consider in trying to decide whether or how much a person who does this job should be paid. Here's one that I'd like to address a little bit. All of the things being equal, here we have a job, whether it's digging ditches or servicing a jet engine, and we have an individual that we're going to pay. Should the character of the individual that we are going to pay factor in to what we pay them? A person who is a very honest and decent person and hardworking and all of that, or here is a rotter. He shows up for work, he does his job, but he cheats on his wife all the time. But other than that, you wouldn't know he does his job the same. Should we reward people who try to be good and right and do the right thing in all of their life, or should we just limit it to how well do you do your job? What do you think?
I would say yes, because if you know these facts and you're the employer or whatever, in the long run, the individual that is trustworthy and, he not only does his job, but he goes above and beyond. And that person's going to make a better employee over the long run than the guy who just shows up for 8 hours, does his stuff, and goes home and cheats on his wife.
What about two guys that show up, do their job equally well, one cheats on his wife and one doesn't? One leaves his children and abandons them and goes to another city and gets your job and does just as well as the guy next to him, who's a good family man and goes to church every Sunday. Should we make any distinction there just because we think one person is a better person?
Part of that is a reflection on the company. Nowadays, if you tweet something and your employer doesn't like it, you could get fired.
Yeah, that's true. We're more willing to not hire somebody or pay them less or not pay them at all for bad character than we are to reward good character, right? We sort of figure that you need to hit a minimum amount of character if we're going to pay you at all. And after that, your good character might reward in more money if, in the long run, we think it'll redound to our benefit. Maybe there, I don't know. Yeah.
You're making the assumption that the person, or that we making those decisions, know what we're talking about and that we can judge people properly. We can't. It's a broken world. It's hard to put. You're a good character and you're not, because the person making those judgments may not be a good character.
Sure, absolutely. You know, we started out this discussion last week by talking about limitations and weaknesses. We talked about the fact that people are unequally corrupt and unequally corruptible, and we talked about the fact that information is limited. We cannot control events, and we cannot clearly and reliably know what's going on, and we even less can clearly see the future, okay? So that is very, very important if we are, as a committee, going to make these decisions, because as Mike has pointed out, we're making decisions, but do we have the information necessary to do that? And how much information would we need? And it might be that it's just impossible. But that's one of the things to put in our mind, in our hopper as we consider if you listen to a lot of critiques of the free market capitalist system, a lot of critiques are morally based, if you listen to them. They usually are not efficiency based. Why not? Why don't socialists argue more for the efficiency of their system, why we should be socialists rather than free market capitalists?
Because it's not efficient.
Because there's no data and no experience anywhere in the world to show that that's the case. I don't think anybody really believes that. So why would anybody want to be a socialist then?
It gives the appearance of being fair.
All right, let's give the devil their due. A person may wish to be a socialist because they really believe that it is more moral. And these are the kinds of things that they're thinking about. And more we're going to get to. So when we listen to these critiques, sometimes what you'll hear is somebody seeming like they're really caring to do the right thing and be the right kind of person. We are a committee that God has established to love our neighbor. And so we are asking ourselves now, how should we determine what jobs get paid what? Because what we're really deciding is how much of the stuff of life you and I get to enjoy. And we're implicitly, we're sort of debating whether how much of it is about me and what kind of a person I am, or me and what kind of obligations I have, or me and how hard the work is, or how much I produce. We're asking ourselves which of these things are more important or less important, and we're not coming to decisions. I don't want to try to come to a decision. In fact, if we were to even try to come to a decision, I don't think we could reach agreement on almost any of this, which is a really important thing. You just brought up that even trying to decide on the character issue, how are we going to do that? But that's not the only one of these questions that we might really decide. How are we going to know that? How are we going to know what this person's obligations are as opposed to that person's obligations? How are we really going to know that? And how do you judge the difficulty of this task compared to that task? It kind of depends, doesn't it? You say digging ditches is harder than proofreading text. Well, but this guy may love digging ditches and hates reading anything. He's happy as a clam with it. Should we pay somebody who loves their job less than somebody who doesn't?
They love their job and are obligated to do it.
But a lot of people get paid a lot less doing jobs that they like. Do you know why? Because a lot of jobs that are really, really good A lot of people want them, and if a lot of people want the job, guess what? The price goes down. Some jobs get paid a lot. Do you know why they get paid a lot? Nobody wants them. Do you know why nobody wants them? They're hard. Okay? Either because they take 1,000 years to go to school, or because they're drudgery, or they're dangerous, or things like that. So, I mean, you'd say, well, why would we want to pay somebody less because they like the job? Well, maybe liking the job is part of the compensation. Would that sound fair? You don't have to decide that that's the deciding factor to say, yeah, that sounds fair as far as it goes. You know, everything we've talked about there's as far as it goes. That's not the only consideration. So, character, does it seem wrong that a person, no matter what their character is, they're lying, they're a cheater, they're a no good this, that, and the other thing, but doggone it, they sure can fix an engine, so we're going to pay them the same as anybody else. Does that seem like, doesn't it seem like we ought to pay somebody who can fix an engine and is a good and decent person more, just because we value them? Disregarding whether you could possibly know that.
It's a judgment thing.
Yeah. So we have to acknowledge. All right, now the last one. How about this? Should we pay somebody more because they already have a lot?
Depends how they got that.
They got it all perfectly fine.
Well, then, yeah, they should stay the same, I would imagine.
So if we take somebody and they should have more income because they have more wealth, is that okay?
Depends on their job and, like I said.
How about this? We take somebody and they don't have a job, they don't do anything, but we will pay them if they're rich enough.
In that case, I'm probably not.
So you don't want to?
No.
Anybody got any ideas here? Should we pay anybody? Should we pay anybody $1 million a year for doing nothing if they're rich enough? Now listen, this is a critique you're going to get, because this is at the heart of what we call capitalism. Now think about what capitalism is. Capitalism means private ownership of the means of production. I don't make anything. I don't do anything. But it happens that I own a lot of land and I have a lot of money in the bank. So I take somebody and I say, sir, I want you to take this land and this money and I want you to plant tomatoes. I want you to plant tomatoes as far as the eye can see. And I want you to market these tomatoes and sell these tomatoes, hire whoever you have to do, here's the money, and when it's done I'll pay you a nice salary and I get the profit, and don't bother me again. Does that happen in our culture? Sure. Yeah, yeah. Take away the tomatoes and now I have a factory and it's the same thing. Now, do many people who do that actually don't do anything? That's a different question. We will compensate that person because why? They can make lots of money because of land they already have, tomatoes, or money they already had, okay? And they're not going to do anything. They're going to go, they're going to buy a boat, and they're going to go sailing around the world, and when they come back, they want their money.
They're a good steward of the land.
Well,
Basically, they're doing their talent.
Okay, all right. I'm just saying, does that bother? It seemed to bother. Now, see, it bothered this young man back here. You think, I don't know that we ought to do that. You had.
I was just gonna say, union scale jobs, you throw all this out the door because everybody gets paid the same, whether they work or hard or not.
And is there a moral argument to say we shouldn't pay everybody the same?
I never did like that idea. When you work 3 times as hard as the guy next to you, you're getting the same amount.
Do we all feel comfortable that a person who works 3 times as hard at the same job as another person should get paid more? I think most of us would feel that way. So we would say it's not moral to pay everybody the same thing. What if we were in a magical world? I'm going to get to you, Steve. We're in a magical world where everybody works just as hard and gives it 100% of what they have. Some people have more than others, but everybody works just as hard. The limit of what they are able to do, they do. The limit of their intellectual ability, their physical ability, and the time they give. Nobody works harder than they, everybody works to the limit of their ability. Should they all get the same pay? because some people's ability are much more than others. Should we pay somebody who was lucky enough to be born smarter and stronger more than somebody who, through no fault of their own, was not as smart and is not as strong, but they are both working just as hard and to the limit of what they can do? Steve, you had a question.
Well, the income disparities bother me as much as the fact that some people are born healthier than others. And I'd actually argue that disparate levels of health are probably a lot easier to fix than income. It's just, I think it's just simply, very simply part of being in a broken world.
Well,
I don't see any precedent or command for a collective duty to correct disparity.
okay, well, again, but you are making a moral judgment, and you may be right. That is a moral judgment that we don't have any right to try to correct that. Or on the other hand, we might say, no, it's the height of morality that we want to try to make, because life is unfair, right? So if sick people need more, do we agree that sick people deserve extra care from the rest of us? Yeah, they do. Some people require more, some people are able to give more, just depending upon the vicissitudes of life. That's just the way it goes. Well, why not an income then? Our capitalist system says that if I have a lot of money, I can make a lot of money, and I don't have to work any harder than anybody else. In fact, if I have enough money, I don't actually have to work at all. Now you say I have to be a good steward. You're right. I have to make a good steward decision. But you know what? So does the ditch digger. The ditch digger also has to be a good steward of whatever time he's got. We all have to be good stewards. This guy is a good steward and he makes $100 million. That guy's a good steward and he gets a nice little bonus of a 50 cents an hour, you know, or overtime, a time and a half for his digging ditches. Now, so we have significant inequalities. But then we might say, but people are unequal. And we are all comfortable enough in moral judgments to say, people who are of different characters, in other words, if you're not a nice person, we're more comfortable punishing you. In fact, if you're bad enough, we'll put you in prison. Whereas really good people, we want rewarded. But in reality, how we divvy out the stuff of life does not, except as our character relates to our productivity, we don't really pay people that way. If you're bad enough, you'll get fired, you won't be able to get hired, you'll be in jail. If you're good enough that means that people can count on you and so forth, maybe you'll get more money. But for the most part, we don't pay people based on character. I say for the most part. Do you agree with that? Yeah. Okay. I don't know why I did that. Mostly our free market economy likes to compensate people based upon productivity. That's the theory. The more we produce, either is generally the more a job is worth. And how do we determine what is produced? Or what should be produced? See, here's an interesting thing. The free market economy determines what should be produced by how? What people want. And what people want, what do? They pay for it. The more you want, the more you're willing to pay for it. The more you're willing to pay for it, the more people will produce it. The more people produce it, the more there is and the price comes down. If the price goes down too low, well then, people stop producing it because they're not making any money. If people stop wanting it, okay, well then the price goes down because nobody wants it. So supply and demand. So what produces a price and what tells us what we're going to, and in the end, that correlates to what people are making somewhere, is what people want. So in our society, if you produce what people want, you can make lots of money. If you're very good at producing something nobody wants, tough. Okay? You may be very good at it. You may be the best in the world at it. It doesn't matter. On the other hand, you may have figured out some silly little thing that, you know, who would have thunk it? But you're rich now because you learned and figured out how to do the little twist ties on a loaf of bread. And now you're rich. And who would have thunk that would have done it? So for us, it's very impersonal. If you can figure out what people want, you can make money. We don't care if you're a cad. When we say we don't care, I don't mean we don't care personally. I mean the market will reward you if you can produce what people want. Now, from a moral point of view, is what people want necessarily good? Here is another argument that you'll get from critics of the free market system. They'll say, well, wait a minute, which is better, pornography or the opera? Which is better? Which is a more socially desirable thing to be produced? Which do you think makes more money? Well, you also hear this standard thing. Why would we pay teachers this amount and people who are good at throwing a ball 100 times more? That's another critique about the social desirability of why do we pay so much to these people, but this is a much more valuable thing. Is that the idea that there are some things that are socially desirable and other things that are not? Is that a moral issue? I think so. I think so. And we might decide that in a perfect world, we would have a lot less pornography. Well, if it's a perfect world, we know how much pornography we would have. And maybe we wouldn't have all opera. Maybe it would be musicals too. Who knows? Okay, so the thing is, the free market produces what people want, not necessarily what's good, and you get rich by producing what people want, not necessarily what's good. Sometimes what's good is what you produce, and sometimes it's not. But the way the market compensates people is for producing what others want, not necessarily what we all agree is good. Some things we produce a lot of that we all agree that's not good. And then there are other things that we really wish there was more of it. So, for example, many people decry what Walmart has done to small businesses across the nation, small retailers. They're just destroying them. But then the counter-argument is Walmart's not destroying them, you're destroying them because you go to Walmart. If you want to go to the small local grocer, then go to the small grocer. Well, I can't, it's too much money. Okay. All right then, Walmart's not destroying them, you are. Well, either one way or the other, somebody's destroying. So we say we should have small neighborhood markets. Should. But the market says, well, no, we shouldn't. How do you know that? Because they're all going away. In fact, markets of almost all kinds are going away these days because of what? The internet. The internet's destroying everything from the point of view of little local neighborhood things. Pretty soon, nothing is going to be the neighborhood. It's going to be the Amazon delivery truck. That's what's going to be everywhere. Do we like that? So the market gives us what we're going to pay for. It's very, I mean, it's a machine. It's not asking what's good or bad. It's asking what do you want? What are you willing to pay for? Okay? Is that a moral way to make a decision? Now, I don't want to be suspected of being a leftist. It's important that we ask the questions and realize the issue because the issues are real. And if we Christians are going to say, yeah, but, then we need to know the but. Okay? One last thing before we wrap this up. There are a variety of things that relate to fairness that we might want to consider when we're trying to decide who has what. So we might want to adjust what otherwise would be a person's lot in life because they had bad parents. And if you had bad parents, you might be of bad character and you may not be well educated. So why should we punish somebody because they're not as well educated and not as productive because they were raised in a family that just didn't teach them anything or didn't teach them the value of hard work? That's not their fault. And so maybe we need to compensate for that. Or the fact that somebody is born in Appalachia rather than Silicon Valley makes a difference. Where you were born might make a big difference in terms of, you know, if you grew up in the inner city, it might be different than if you grew up somewhere else. If you just have a lack of raw talent, why should we punish people by making them live in small houses and old cars and not have much? Yes?
It's interesting that you say that because based on where you practice in dentistry, in insurance companies pay at different rates.
Correct. They do that for lawyers too.
Cost of living supposedly in that area.
Oh, yeah. Listen, if I was in California, my billable hour would be 3 times what it is here.
It costs you that much.
Yes, same thing. Oh, it's not more complicated. It's the same thing everywhere you go. But if you're in New York or California, you get paid a lot more money. The thing is, if somebody doesn't have much of an IQ or much raw talent, one could say that we consign them to living in small houses, wearing old clothes, their kids can't go to the nicest colleges and all that. And what did they do? They're sterling. Think of Forrest Gump. A sterling character, but in Forrest Gump's case, everything he got was because he happened to be in the right place at the right time. The thing is, in a good world, is that really what we want? So if we want to make it fair, we need to adjust for these things. Some people have personalities that are more winning. You just want to pay them more, and others you just don't like. What about people who've had a load of past mistakes? Yeah, they've been in and out of jail a few times, but they've got their act together now, trust me. Some people have had less opportunity, some people have poor health, some people have just suffered bad luck. If we want to make it fair, we're going to have to account for all of this. Folks, how brilliant do we have to be as a committee to make these adjustments with anything near what we might call fairness? If we could even decide what fairness is, which we haven't bothered with. Now, the point that I'm making this far is, if we want to sit down and develop a moral system of dividing up goods and services among people, you are talking about something that is well above our pay grade. In fact, we might very well argue that other than God himself, the rest of us wouldn't know where to begin. I mean, we might be able to attack one specific job, one specific type of thing, one specific circumstance, and make it better than it is right now. But we couldn't possibly just generally manage this thing. And if we tried, what we would end up with is not something that we would agree is more fair. It might be more fair for this person, less fair for that one, and a disaster for everybody else. Who knows? Do we agree that the task of being moral, as we try to decide who makes what and who lives where and how big of a house you're allowed to have, do we agree that a human being, that is just beyond what a human being can do? My task in this is to say, it's fine to say that there are moral questions involved here. There are. These are all moral questions. Every one that we've discussed, some are more important than others. But if you want to run the world in this way by being moral and good and right, and therefore we're going to take the reins of the economy and fashion it the way it should be, we have our work cut out for us, because a lot of very basic questions we weren't sure even where to start with, let alone where to end up with. Now, we do, however, have this basic question. There is an alternative. You know what it is. It's a free market capitalist type economy. Those are not the same, but nevertheless, for our purposes, we'll treat them as the same. We can just let the market decide. Now, a critique would be, how moral is that? To allow the stuff of life, remember, we're talking about how long people live and how healthy they are and whether they can take vacations with their children or send their children to a private school or not. We're not talking about whether you get to have steak every night or you have to put up a chicken. We're not talking about that. We're talking about much more significant things. And you're just going to turn that all over to the market to make these very, very important decisions? Can you hear somebody criticizing us for doing a thing like that? So why will we do it? I'm going to give you 3 real quick reasons why we can justify doing this. And by justify, I'm not giving you, by the way, a thus as the Lord. I'm going to give you the equivalent here. Have we in this country decided that we are going to allow freedom of religion here? Have we decided that? Have we decided, therefore, that we are going to allow people with the protection of the law to commit idolatry? Have we decided on that? Have we decided that we are going to allow them to fester in their little horrible little idolatrous congregations and teach one another and spread their stuff that is actually going to poison the minds of others as they try to spread their false doctrines? Are we going to allow that to happen in our midst? Yes? Do we agree that that is terribly evil in God's eyes? Do we agree that all that is terrible? Yes. Why do we allow it? Okay, so we're protecting ourselves, aren't we? Basically, we Christians are comfortable saying in the market of ideas, we're willing to fight the good fight against the idolaters. And we don't want anybody trying to stop what we're doing, so we're not going to try to stop what they're doing. So we're going to allow the idolaters to be idolaters because that protects our right and ability to do what? To worship the one true God. All right, so if you want to take a look at the market environment and see, here's some three quick and dirty moral defenses of letting the market decide what are otherwise very important moral questions. So, for example, one of is just the enormously increased efficiency of the free market. That's just a fact of an empirical fact. Now, let me ask you this. All of the things being equal, is it morally superior to have more or less? All other things being equal. You might make a quibble on that. Jesus, we might decide that if we get too rich, even if we all get too rich, actually it's not as good. We might really decide that more people will go to heaven if all of us were just a little bit hungrier. But we have no idea what level of hunger that is, and nevertheless, it's the Word of God that's going to be saving people. So we're going to decide that all of the things being equal, it's better to have more than less. And the free market capitalist system, better than any other system that's out there right now, produces wealth. Now, there are costs, but nevertheless, an additional reason why, whoops, I got it up there already. The market is impersonal, and that's good for a Christian. Why would it be good for a Christian? See, we're all smug and comfortable because we're the committee making all these decisions. We could be smug and comfortable also if we weren't on the committee but we knew somebody on the committee. We could be smug and comfortable also if we thought like the people on the committee. But what if we don't? What if the committee is not made up of Christians trying to follow the Word of God and love their neighbor as theirself? What if the committee is made up of different kinds of people with different ideas? Remember that an oppressive, despotic government can do bad things to us, but somebody who controls the economy holds all the keys to the kingdom. So you might want to consider that for us, I'd rather not have anybody deciding how I'm going to live, because if somebody or some committee is deciding how we're going to live, they might decide tomorrow that we just don't need to waste resources on churches. We don't need to waste resources on pastors. We don't need to waste resources on things that Christians need to. But we're always going to have pastors as long as there are Christians who are willing to do what? Become one, hire one, put up with one, or whatever. We're always going to have churches as long as we're willing to pay somebody to build us a building. They don't care. So that's good. Impersonal means we don't have to worry about the enemy getting hold of this and oppressing Christians because they just don't value what we do. It's impersonal. The other thing is it's diffuse. Remember my tomato? I have tomatoes. I can grow tomatoes. Well, if you have one agency, the government produces all tomatoes, and only the government produces tomatoes. And the government decides tomorrow that tomatoes are red, and red is bad, because red states are bad. So we're not going to have tomatoes anymore, or we're going to have blue tomatoes, or something else. It doesn't matter what they decide. They decide tomatoes aren't good for you. Tomatoes are wicked. God is against tomatoes. It doesn't matter. One group can decide no more tomatoes, and tomorrow we don't have any tomatoes. I like tomatoes. It doesn't matter. I can't get them. If you think about tomatoes, that's silly. But you can think about a lot of things that are much more valuable that somebody might decide you don't need. But the market doesn't work that way. The market decides by millions and millions of decisions, day after day after day. So no one person can decide I can't buy tomatoes anymore, or a personal computer, or a car that I like, or build a church. Nobody can do that. A lot of people might be able to do that, but it's hard to do. So that's a second way in which we Christians say it might not be the most moral thing to do to turn over all of this to a market, but on the other hand, there's safety in that. Because I can live with that, you can live with that, nobody's going to get the controls of this, so we'll just go ahead and play by the same rules as everybody else, and we'll figure it out. So there's safety in this for Christians in the way that if there really was a committee planning all of this, it's a little bit like giving a committee the right to decide what religions get to be practiced in our nation. It's great if they're Lutheran, even better if they're Missouri Synod. But let's face it, what if they're not even Christian? And they might decide tomorrow that we just don't, or you can have Christians but just one or two types, that's it. We don't need different types of Lutherans, that's ridiculous. We don't even need different kinds of Christians. You can just all be one church and that's it. And we'll have one Buddhist organization, we'll have one Muslim, and that's it. Because it's just too complicated, it's wasting too many resources. We don't have to worry about that in our country because we have freedom of religion. Well, you might decide that a free market is part of the way of protecting our individual freedoms. There are costs in this. The market does produce a lot of socially undesirable behaviors because people do undesirable things and are willing to pay for it. And the market produces them with great efficiency. So we don't like that. And we wish it weren't that way, but that's the way it is. And it does produce not only inequalities in wealth, but strange results. Some people get paid enormous amounts of money just because they can put a ball in a hoop, whereas other people who work very, very hard, do very, very valuable, socially valuable things, actually don't get paid very much. The standard example would be your local cop. And then capitalism does come at a high human cost. There's everlasting competition in a capitalist free market system. Everlasting competition. And there's this thing we talked about before, the creative destruction. Industries come and industries go, and every time that happens, a lot of people are thrown out of work, have to move, and sometimes the suffering is significant, okay? So there are costs in this. All right, enough of this. I've wanted to discuss the many, many moral issues involved in just our daily, ordinary stuff of life. And this is why Christians need to think clearly about why we do or don't support various things. It's not just a matter of, well, God is obviously a Republican because look, and therefore and God is obviously free market, so look. I mean, there are goods and bads to each of these, and we Christians need to understand from the point of view of God what sorts of things we can live with and what sorts of things we really ought to be a little bit more resistant about, or at least be more clear-minded about. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we ask that you would bless our nation and bless your holy Christian church throughout the world. Help us, Lord, to recognize that the task of trying to be and make this world the way it ought to be, or the way the world will be in the world to come, is humbling to say the least. Help us, Lord, to instead trust in you and let us use our human wisdom as best we can to do the best we can for our neighbors and for ourselves while we wait for you to set things straight. Amen.